this thing on? Okay. So we're going to get started in just a few moments, if everyone can find a seat. Thank you all for coming and joining us, especially on such a beautiful day outside when you could be enjoying the sunshine. So thank you for coming to this event that we are putting on today. This is the inaugural event for New Line's Gender Policy Portfolio. The goal of our gender policy portfolio is to incorporate gendered and intersectional lenses into our work on global policy and geopolitics. Our three main projects that we are focusing on right now are on women, peace, and security, gender as an analytical tool of foreign policy, and global responses to sexual and gender-based violence. We want to provide policymakers with the tools to strengthen foreign and domestic objectives by consistently weaving these types of analyses throughout our policies. And so we have some of our past reports which exemplify this kind of work on the side table back there. So please have a look at them after the event. Please take them with you after the panel. We also have some mugs and notebooks. These are for you. Please take them. It will help me with my cleanup after tonight. So please enjoy them. In December, New Lines published a report on harmful masculinities in the U.S. military and the threat to force readiness, which you all have. It was authored by Kinsey Spears and Caroline Hayes here tonight. And so this panel of experts will examine this issue further, looking at what a masculinities approach is, how conversations about gender and military have shifted over the years, and much more. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our panel tonight, beginning with our moderator, Kinsey Spears. Kinsey is a senior non-resident fellow for the New Lines Gender Policy Portfolio and is a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School, where she's writing about women, peace, and security agenda in the Department of Defense. Kinsey is also a CNAS Sean Brimley Next Generation National Security Leader. And prior to beginning graduate school, Kinsey worked for Senator Gillibrand, served as a Peace Corps volunteer, and graduated from the University of Georgia. Our next panelist, Andrea Goldstein, is the Acting Director of Force Resiliency for the Department of the Navy, as well as a Navy veteran and Reserve Intelligence Officer. She was previously a senior advisor on the House Veterans Affairs Committee. She's a member of the Truman National Security Project, Council on Foreign Relations, and Pat Tillman Scholar. She's written numerous articles and is the co-author of 3 books on national security topics. Miles B. Kaggins III is a retired U.S. Army colonel. He's a seasoned public relations executive, a words warrior, with 26 years of national security leadership and communication experience. He is also a senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute, where he provides expertise on public information warfare, Iraq, Syria, U.S.-Kurdish relations, ISIS, and military culture. From military posts, combat zones, inside the Pentagon, and the White House, he has led communication strategy for some of the most challenging issues of the past decade, including military personnel policy and the implementation of the U.S. Army's People First program. He served 3-year-long combat tours in Iraq, most recently as spokesman for the Global Coalition to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria, where he led a multinational communication team representing 78 nations. And last but not least, Caroline Hayes is the Senior Strategic Initiatives Officer at Equimundo, where she oversees special projects and research related to masculinities, combating online radicalization, and care equity. Caroline previously worked in both policy and advocacy spaces on gender-based violence prevention with the U.S. Department of Justice and the Global Women's Institute. She also spent several years focused on gender equality programming at Vital Voices Global Partnership and the U.S. Peace Corps. Thank you so much again, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for being here, and I'll hand it off to Kinsey to start the conversation.
Thank you, Emily. So Caroline, I want to start with you, and we wrote this report together, which was an excellent experience. And can you talk a little bit about the report, why we wrote it, and also what you mean when you talk about a masculinities approach?
Yeah. Is my mic? Oh, hello, everybody. Yeah, my name's Caroline. I work at Equimundo Center for Masculinities and Social Justice, and as a part of my academic background, I wrote about the connection between national security and gender analysis. And so I guess to take Kinsey's questions a little bit backwards, I'm going to start by talking about what a masculinities approach or a masculinities lens means. which many of you in the room here might be familiar with, but just to sort of level set, I think it would be helpful just to start talking about that to begin with. I think in my experience, when I say I look at gender or gender analysis, people often associate that with the idea or the notion that gender is somehow synonymous with the word woman, which often lends itself to gender issues becoming women's issues. And so, unfortunately, in the past, that has led women to take the burden or the onus to be on women to sort of solve these issues. But really what a masculinities approach tries to do is to recognize the way that men and boys are also socialized into a gendered world and that they are gendered beings as well. And so I think that what's important to note also is the use of the word masculinities as a plural word and not just the word masculinity, because I think that there's this idea that there's this somehow singular idea of what it means to be a man, when in reality, men understand themselves and their manhood very differently across culture, across race, class, time, et cetera. And so that's a very intentional use of the word masculinities. But there are, however, several common norms or themes or patterns that emerge when we look at how men and boys are socialized into the world today. And those are kind of defined in sort of stereotypes or messages or social expectations around what it means to be a man. And some examples of that include being emotionally stoic or being emotionally unavailable. It can include making sure you're physically strong or you know, living up to sort of a high standard of physical strength. It can be, you know, not seeking help when services may be available. So there are certain themes or patterns that we see in masculinity as it's defined in the US in some ways. However, I do want to mention that this idea of masculinities is not necessarily a negative thing. There are certain ways in which these norms can be taken as positive. For example, like the need to, you know, the identifying as a sort of the protector or defender can actually be a really positive thing when looking at, you know, how teammates support each other. But then on the other hand, there are also several ways in which these norms kind of turn in a more negative way when they're taken to the extreme, or when men feel like they have to establish dominance or control in order to sort of achieve social status or what have you. And that can manifest itself in very harmful ways, including ways that lend men to take harm on themselves as well as people around them. And so that can mean, as I said, like not, you know, seeking help when they need it. It can mean like bullying or intimidation, things like that. And so when we were looking at a masculinities approach, it's uncovering those norms that exist that may result in sort of extreme behaviors sometimes, and then applying that to sort of social institutions. And so that leads me to sort of how we started writing this report and how I kind of got interested in the US military in general, which is that it is in some ways the institutional embodiment of the role of the protector or defender. And so when we're applying a masculinities lens to the institution of the military itself, we're looking at the ways that sort of these norms get manifested in the organizational culture of the military itself. And so I think just to start off with, in this report, we recognize the incredible progress that the US military has made in terms of incorporating women into the ranks in the armed forces, and also the incredible progress the US military has made in terms of addressing the several harms and challenges that women have faced in the military itself through things like the Independent Review Commission report on sexual assault in the military, as well as the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. However, within things like the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, there is a reticence to talk about men and masculinities and sort of gender from the other side, not necessarily just women's issues. And so that led Kinsey and I to sort of dig into how, you know, men aren't really talked about as gendered beings in the military, and how they experience trauma might be different in a specific cultural context than how women might be experiencing trauma. And so what we hope to do was really make the connections between the idea of force readiness, and then through that, make the through lines to sort of how harmful norms of masculinity and the ways that those get kind of extrapolated in the military and extreme conditions and situations of trauma can have an impact on men themselves in terms of them harming themselves as well as people around them. And so a couple of the things we looked at, just to close out some of my comments, we looked at drug use, we looked at alcohol abuse, we looked at sexual assault, and suicide rates as some examples of the ways that those norms kind of manifest themselves. And so, yeah, with that, we'll probably dig more deeply into that later, but that's just a little overview of sort of the theoretical framing of our work, as well as how we kind of applied it to this specific institution and workforce itself.
Thank you. Andrea and Miles, both of you have had long and successful careers in the military. How have you seen masculinities play out and change during your tenure, both positively and negatively?
Please.
All right. So I'm here as a civilian, but the question is asking about my military career. And I've also served in uniform for 13 years, half in the active component and now half in the reserves. So I'm going to start by talking about my uniformed experience, and I'm going to land the plane on what I do as a civilian. I think that the point about protection and defending can be a very positive aspect when applied from a masculinities lens in the military. And for me, that has been people who looked out for me. Every single one of my mentors, up until maybe my 10-year mark, both in my military and then my civilian career, have been men, and who put me in positions where there had never been a woman. There was one where there had never actually been a junior officer, and also checked in with me and looked out for me, understanding that my experience was going to be different than my male peers. They may not have understood how that was going to be different, but they did know that was going to be different. From the standpoint of negative experiences, it was some of these were taking place in the same environments. And I wrote a paper back in 2017 called "Why Are You Trying to Destroy the Last Good Thing Men Have? Understanding Resistance to Women in Combat Jobs." Because something that was absolutely fascinating to me, particularly when I was serving in Naval Special Warfare, which is the SEAL teams, was that I would be on deployment with a team of people that I had trained with, who'd known me for months, who professionally respected me, who then also felt comfortable saying to me, while we're in an operational environment, but you don't think women should really be in combat and should be SEALs, do you? And I'm looking around, I'm like, where are we right now? And it was a very bizarre situation to be in, where the leap some of my colleagues couldn't make was women having the same job code, even though the actual job that was being performed in an operational environment was similar or identical. And to talk about on the positive side, I also had, there's a great book I would recommend folks look at called Good Guys by Johnson and Smith, that specifically examines the role of male mentors and mentoring women to help women break through some of those barriers. And now I want to tie this into where this applies to what I do for my day job as a civilian, working on addressing interpersonal and self-directed harm. So we have data in the Department of Defense through a study that's called the Workforce and Gender Relations Survey, and we do it every few years. And that study found that there's a significant correlation between hostile work environments, bullying, gender discrimination, and sexual harassment, and showing that that all of those experiences increase the risk of sexual assault both for men and women. In fact, experiencing that puts you at even higher risk if you're a man than if you're a woman. But what we did was we illustrated what that risk was and then shared intervention strategies. So then that's a tool to say, this is how you can protect your teammate against this scourge. And it's now using something that we're very familiar with in the military, and it's this masculinized idea of protecting and defending, and actually using it to combat gender-based violence. Miles.
My friend Earl reminded me that 20 years ago, about 20 years ago this month, we were headed to Iraq for our first deployment there as captains in the Army. And I think of that experience in terms of our conversation this way. This was my first combat deployment, and I recall when I was commissioned into the Army out of Hampton University, how proud I was to follow in my father's footsteps of serving as an Army officer, and then now I was going to serve our country in combat. Nothing that I was aspiring to do, but something that I had been training for and training my troops to do. And let me further describe this experience. I was with 2nd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division. I commanded a forward support company. This is a logistics company providing food service, supply, maintenance, and transportation, and also running a detention facility for an infantry and armor battalion. One day in the Diyala province at a place called Forward Operating Base Warhorse in the summer of 2003, May 2003 specifically, the battalion commander and infantrymen with all of the company commanders, there were 6 of us, went around to observe the defensive positions where there were Bradley fighting vehicles and Abrams tanks, the kind of tanks that are headed to Ukraine now. And inside each of these vehicles, there were what we called morale pics. These were photos that the all-male crewmen had. Some of them had photos of their wife or girlfriend back home, but most of them had pin-up girls or more. And the leaders, I was one of the leaders, would inspect these morale pics at the same way we were inspecting their sector range cards and their weapon systems, and it was all ha-ha, funny, funny. My company had around 30 women assigned. Our company was not assigned directly in a solid line. We didn't get personnel through the infantry battalion because there couldn't be women in combat. So what the Army did was use some gamesmanship and said, all right, we'll have them assigned to the logistics battalion so there can be women in the unit, but we'll attach them with a dashed line and some memos so they can work for the infantry unit. Fast forward to 2015, the late, great Secretary of Defense Carter integrated all career fields for women in all services. 2017, you had this conversation. In 2023, here we are having an advanced conversation about masculinities in the military, both good and bad. So, of course, we know that we're going to the bad, that if there's a culture where the leaders think that the older men are talking to the younger men and encouraging them and saying this is being a man by having these type of pictures, that can also lead to behavior where women are objectified. And I ended up having several women in my unit who were either harassed or sexually assaulted during the deployment, to now a place where through an increased density of women in all services, a recognition and comeuppance among the mostly men who lead the services, that we are now instituting policies and cultural change from top to bottom and bottom to top. And the masculine behaviors where I talked about being willing to serve, being willing to go fight for a nation are good, but also those same type of behaviors of protecting your brother or sister are things that we need within our service to live up to the values that we espouse. And as another anecdotal data point on another deployment, I saw masculine behavior of bullies bullying a soldier who ended up committing suicide, as you've looked at in your research. So there is some good and bad, but Certainly, talking about masculinity should not be some space that is thought of as a pejorative. In fact, this is about understanding the leaders and the led so that our Defense Department and all the people, men and women, civilians and military, are able to accomplish our nation's missions effectively.
Thank you both so much for both of those stories that you shared. Caroline, one thing that we discussed in our report quite a bit is drug use and alcohol overconsumption and other risky behaviors that men engage in the military sometimes. Can you elaborate on why that is linked to masculinities and also how that affects force readiness?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks so much for sharing your experiences. It's so helpful to hear people talk about their actual lived experiences in relation to these issues, because sometimes we can get so wrapped up in the data and whatnot, you lose the sense of the human quality behind it, which is really what we're looking at. And speaking of data, I think it's, I guess firstly, I'll say that there are several different gender norms that we can talk about as it relates to risky behaviors, but I'll give 2 examples of some of the things that we looked at. And kind of off the point of data and drug use, it's actually quite difficult to uncover really specific data in the US military around the use of drugs, not least because, it's illegal, so who's going to self-report as someone who's using drugs, but also just due to the kind of secretive or classified nature of some of the special operating units and whatnot, it's really hard to find some of that data. But what we do know and what we have seen in articles in the media as well as reports from the DoD is that there is illicit drug use in relation to the expectations of performing in really high stress environments. And that can be through the use of substances in order to enhance performance, so using steroids in order to live up to certain physical standards in the military, and also as a palliative for trauma or injury. And so those are connected to masculine norms because when you set certain physical standards for, in order to pass a test or whatnot, or live up to some sort of Superman idea or hero warrior in such a way that sets expectations for men and women too, that might not necessarily be a reality for them, it leads to many people turning to substance use in order to meet those standards. And and secondly, it connects to the norm of just not seeking help when needed and kind of brushing off injuries or things because they might be perceived as weak or not elevated up the ranks of the military. So that can lead to many, often men, turning to drugs in order to kind of cope with that. Which leads me to the second point, which is sort of the alcohol abuse there's a bit more data on, as we saw in the incredible efforts of the IRC report to kind of pull out how sometimes, in high stress environments and in situations of heightened exposure to trauma, often men aren't taught effective coping mechanisms or coping strategies to deal with that trauma and turn to alcohol as sort of, again, like a palliative to deal with that. Obviously, that's not always the case, and obviously there are several men and women and people who are able to effectively deal with the emotional or physical trauma that occurs from service. But I think there's another point to be made here about the use of alcohol in the military with a bit more nuance, and that's that, interestingly, in a lot of sociological studies, there are comparisons between American frat culture and military culture in the sense that alcohol is used as a form, like a bonding ritual, or sort of leaning on traditions and games through the use of alcohol in order to get to know one another, connect with each other, and transgress certain social hierarchies or boundaries that are set up by society. So in a funny way, there are certain positive ways you could look at that. But on the other hand, you have to look at the long-term deleterious effects of that behavior, and maybe how that use of alcohol through games and masculine bonding could be exclusionary to some people. So yeah, again, just want to note that there is a lot of nuance here, and there are a lot of different experiences, and we're very fortunate to have the efforts of the DoD to provide some of this more specific data in the survey that Andrew was talking about beforehand. So, yeah.
Thank you. Miles, you worked at Fort Hood during the Vanessa Guillen murder. And how have you noticed conversations around masculinity and gender shift both during that tragic time and since then?
In April 2020, there was a soldier at Fort Hood, Specialist Vanessa Guillen, a young lady from Houston, Texas, who disappeared from her duties as a small arms repair soldier. Thinking back in our memories, this was during the height of the pandemic, and at the time, Fort Hood had soldiers who were mostly reporting in for duty via text messages, and there were not large formations of people, so there wasn't the traditional method of accountability. She came in for duty and was killed by one of her fellow soldiers, Specialist Aaron Robinson. This became a large world media event because she was missing for several weeks and was later found in the summer, partially dismembered and buried in central Texas. This event caused during my 26-year career, the largest policy and cultural change. In fact, I don't recall too many discussions related to changing our culture, and Vanessa Guillen's life is now codified in federal law. There are murals across the world to her honor and a big sign at the entrance to Fort Hood, Texas in her honor. I was deployed to Iraq at the time, but when I came back in September 2020, my commander looked me in the eyes and said, "Hey, Colonel Kaggans, sorry you can't take any vacation, and I need you to fix this situation of all the bad press." And I'm thinking, we're not going to tweet our way out of this one, boss. And one of the things I identified as spokesman is that the Guillen family and her activist attorney and congresspersons in the broader public are not the enemies of the Defense Department. They're not the enemies of the United States military, the Army, or Fort Hood. These were very concerned citizens. And one of the things that the Army, funded by American taxpayers, must do is protect our soldiers, all volunteers, and provide an environment where everybody is valued, treated with dignity and respect, and is healthy and out of harm's way, particularly from fellow soldiers. So the former Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy, did in my move a very bold thing against the wishes of many generals and said, we're going to do an investigation, not just a little investigation conducted by the local command. We're going to have a full comprehensive investigation that's going to bring in experts from the FBI, experts from academia, and the private sector, who are going to do a comprehensive survey that included more than 3,000 troops at Fort Hood to find out what's going on with the culture there and what are some of the circumstances that could lead to an environment where we would have a soldier killed on post by another soldier. From that, there were policy changes called People First. And People First policy changes did a few things that I'll highlight, and they come into different baskets of quality of life, law enforcement, some policies related to uniforms, hair and grooming standards, but all of them to create an environment where everybody can feel welcome and bring their full self to work, and with bottom-up inputs. So much of the conventional military is about top-down, do what we say. We've come up this way, and we will tell you what to do, how to dress, how to be, and everything else. That's good in some aspects, but we're in a military that is intergenerational with some baby boomers at the top, a lot of Gen X in senior management, millennials through the middle ranks and the sergeants, and then into Gen Z. And there are some of all the traditions and values don't change, but some of the way we do things has changed, and for a good reason. So in 2023, we are now seeing that women in all services can wear ponytails in their uniforms. Previously, it was seen as being unprofessional. Well, if there's a bunch of men with buzz cuts making all the decisions, I guess a ponytail would seem unprofessional, but certainly didn't get in the way of work. We were able to see the Super Bowl flyover of all women crews and fighter pilots and fighter jets and ground crews in a way where we're able to even marshal up enough pilots to have something like that. Unthinkable 2 decades ago. And it wouldn't have been in the forefront, I think, of defense leaders to even showcase such an effort. But now there will be a broader group of people, men and women, who see that these roles are open to all and everybody is capable. We have much more accountability and transparency for leaders who do not take the right actions to investigate allegations of crime or trends and other behaviors that are harmful to individuals or unit cohesion. And these are all a result of the disappearance and tragic death of Specialist Vanessa Guillen, and I think these efforts will continue, and they're refreshed and they're studied, at least in the Army, they're studied and surveyed through the Walter Reed Institute of Research and informing policy decisions within the Defense Department. And on the legislative slide, there are laws that are now making investigations for sexual harassment and assault formally in legal ways done with more an independent look. And the president has even signed executive orders and changes to the Uniform Code of Military Justice that bring in more rules for things people can be charged with or investigated to ensure there's good order and discipline. These things take time, though. It takes a lot of time to change culture. It doesn't just happen if you put something on paper, and everybody's got to be involved top to bottom, and we can't move on from this because we get distracted by balloons in the stratosphere or the latest provocations from Russia.
Thank you. Andrea, as you mentioned, you've worked both in the Navy, now at the Department of the Navy, and on Capitol Hill. And in this work, you've spent a lot of time thinking about how to address issues around sexual violence and also suicide prevention. Can you talk a little bit about how masculinities are related to these issues and what the military is doing to address it? Big question, sorry.
Huge question. Thanks, Kinsey. And so I'm going to start by following up on something that Miles shared about how long some of these reforms will take. But I also want to recognize the value of persistent and patient advocacy. This current iteration of, there have been a couple of generations of advocacy regarding sexual violence in the military. I think the first generation we can really look at was in the 1980s, that there were some GAO reports, but that's really when the first hearings on sexual violence experienced by women veterans took place. And then there was another round in the early 90s regarding the tailhook scandal. And then this generation really started around in the early 2000s with a big push in 2011, 2012, when the documentary The Invisible War came out. So over that time, you had a generation of veterans who became advocates, who persistently advocated on Capitol Hill and with the executive branch for reforms in this area. And they incrementally got them. And in the 116th Congress, there was something set up called the Women Veterans Task Force. And so I was the senior policy advisor for the Women Veterans Task Force, which meant that I was the sole professional staff member who was devoted to issues related to women veterans, service women, military sexual trauma for 100% of my job. Which meant that I spent a lot of time working with advocates on these issues. And what I can share with you is that when Vanessa Guillen was missing, and then when her body was found, there was this absolute rage in the advocacy community of advocates who were also ready to go into action because they had been they had already been persistent. And so they also surrounded the Guillen family with support and were able to advocate on her behalf and then on behalf of everyone who continues to serve. So for all of you who are in advocacy, please keep at it. You will never get 100% of what you want 100% of the time. But for many of these reforms, we will get there. And one of the biggest ones, recommendation 1.1 on the Independent Review Commission in Sexual Assault in the Military was to create an independent prosecutor's office called the Office of Special Trial Counsel. This completely upturns the way that military justice is performed because it takes prosecution of felonies outside of the chain of command. The chain of command is sacrosanct in the military, but the CEO of a private company is not expected to investigate or prosecute rape or murder or any felony. And so why should that apply to the military? And now it doesn't. So by the end of 2023, December 27th, 2023, those offices in all of the services are going to be in place. I came to the Department of the Navy in June of 2021, I think the day the report came out. It was that week. And we had a lot of efforts to take on implementing all 82 recommendations. But before we did that, one of the first things that I asked my team to do was to stop using passive voice. And the reason I did that is A, because it's good grammar, and I just am sometimes a frustrated English professor. But B, it's also because I realized that you're obscuring the actor. And so we might be talking about the person who is experiencing sexual violence, but we're not talking about the person who's perpetrating that sexual violence. And the data shows us in the military, I love me some evidence basis. 95% of those who are perpetrating sexual assault and sexual harassment are men. That other 5% is unknown assailant. It might be a group, or it might be, in some cases, women. But that 5% is a mix. 95% of people who are perpetrating sexual violence in the military are men. Now, for those who are experiencing sexual violence, one of the other myths that I've had to frequently dispel with data is that it's primarily women. It is those who experience sexual violence in the military are disproportionately women because it's approximately, it depends, the Marine Corps kind of skews the data because there's still less than 10% women, but about 20% of the armed forces are women. So when you see a disproportionate number of women experiencing sexual assault, that's one thing. But by the numbers, there's still a pretty large proportion of men experiencing sexual violence in the military. It's about, between the military and veterans, about 1 in 4 women experience sexual violence. That includes sexual assault and sexual harassment, and 1 in 100 men. But the experiences are also different, and this is where we also have to think about masculinities and initiation rituals. Most men who experience sexual assault in the military are sexual assaulted during working hours, in groups, by their coworkers, which means that this is taking place in the workplace. And so that's a very important point to talk about when we're actually talking about gender-based violence and masculinities and femininities, because that is a place where there's masculinities are being performed in a very violent manner, and it's also impacting male service members. And the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military also specifically acknowledged that and directed the department to think about how we can be more culturally competent in supporting different populations of service members who experience sexual assault, and that includes men, members of the LGBTQ community, and also people who are of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And there is a lot more focus on thinking about what do we do with perpetrators. So sexual harassment, both perpetrating and experiencing sexual harassment can increase the risk of either perpetrating or experiencing sexual assault. Recommendation 1.2, and you can look all of these up, of the Independent Review Commission had a number of recommendations that were related to sexual harassment. And one of them, and none of the departments have moved out on this yet, but I want to highlight that this was a recommendation, specifically said that there should be mandatory initiation of separation proceedings for someone who has a substantiated complaint of sexual harassment against them. But that there should also be an off-ramp program where they have the ability to learn, to be educated, to understand how their behavior is wrong, and then in successful completion of that program, be able to be returned to duty. And now this is my personal opinion. I'm just going to keep hitting this microphone. My personal opinion is that that person can potentially be a great messenger and peer educator in what right looks like and how to treat their teammates. I also don't want to lose sight of what the data tells us about suicide in the military. The vast majority of those who die by suicide in the US military are young men under the age of 25. The data looks very different in the veterans community. In the veterans community, it's men 55 to 75. And the reason why more men are dying by suicide in the US military is because of firearms. Men are more likely to use firearms. Now, women are disproportionately attempting suicide, but they are using less lethal means. So we can't shy away from these conversations about lethal means because there is a very clear gender component, and men are less likely to engage in help-seeking behavior, and they're also more likely to use a more lethal means. And so these conversations about help-seeking that you raised, Caroline, is also very critical so that our service members can continue to live.
Thank you, Andrea. Shifting the tone a little bit, I think the fact that we're having this conversation, as you've all mentioned, is quite a change from what you would have had 10 or 20 years ago, or in and around military discourse. And one thing that we haven't talked about is the political nature of it, and around how gender in the military is becoming increasingly politicized. And so how do you all think about or respond to or handle complaints that this conversation or any conversations about gender or masculinities is woke, or it's pushing gender ideology onto our military servicemen and women, and people of any variety of genders, and that's hurting our military? So I'd just like to ask you all to speak on that. Caroline.
Okay, yeah, I'll take it away. I think that this is a obviously complicated question, and everyone has their own opinions on the matter, but I think there are a lot of false narratives out there about the idea of talking about gender or feminism, if you will, is somehow pitting men and women against each other. Or that somehow advocating for the health and safety and well-being and wanting to investigate that more is somehow feminizing the military, which speaks volumes in and of itself in terms of using the word feminizing to be seen as inferior in terms of our armed forces. So I just want to start by saying that, but I think to kind of what I'm really trying to get at is the idea that there are certain expectations around men, just like there are women, about what it means to be a man. And those expectations put men into a box in terms of how they need to, perform certain notions of masculinities that lead to men harming themselves and others. And so it's not necessarily just about like, girl bosses and whatnot and and advancing women and whatnot. That's so important. We need to do that too. But also looking at the ways that, gender ideologies can harm us all. And by actively combating the harmful norms or extreme notions of gender ideologies that lead men and others to harm themselves and others, we're actually working towards our collective benefit. And so I just like to frame it in a more positive light, that this work is really for the collective liberation and benefit of us all, rather than, for like pitting people against each other or elevating others and putting down other people.
Miles?
There's a creed that soldiers have called there's a warrior ethos, and it's, I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I'll never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Didn't say I as a man. It's gender neutral, and it's the attributes and attitudes that we want our service members to have. The Defense Department, I'll say this, is in the managed violence business. That's what we do, managed violence around the world when we have to defeat and deter our enemies. And there are a lot of forces in media and in politics. I just saw a gentleman announce he's running for president, and the first thing he's going to do is delete affirmative action on his very first act as being president. Eliminating affirmative action would greatly harm the work that affirmative action has done in policies that have opened up all opportunities in the military to women and so many other things to make America the #1 economy around the world. So what do we do in the face of these very strong voices and even people who are in elected federal and state and local positions to maintain an environment where everybody has an opportunity to realize their own potential? Well, we have to be aware of this and also have to continue to reinforce culture, policies, and dare I say, politics that would keep America going forward in a place where where everybody, man or woman, can do what it is that they want to do in terms of education opportunities, economic opportunities, career opportunities, and such. But day to day, inside the Defense Department, the broader group of people, the 2.1 million inside the DoD, are in a system where people are patriotic, have good values, and treat people with dignity and respect. Yes, there are some bad apples and bad actors, but there are the minority, the very small minority of people. Yes, there are harmful behaviors, and sadly we lose way too many from car crashes, drunk driving, deaths of despair through overdoses, and of course suicides. And it will take building trust in some of these reforms that we've seen and daily activity to have a military that is ready, where all people are prepared to do our nation's work, either here or abroad.
So I actually don't think it's a particularly complicated question. My responsibility is to prepare a ready, resilient warfighting force. In the Department of the Navy, we have 900,000 sailors, Marines, and civilians. As the executive officer of a reserve unit, I am in charge of 35 of them. And I want the best ones, and I want to win. And in order to win, we need the best that this nation has to offer. And some people have different experiences in life and different experiences of service. And if I can make it easier for the best people to serve in order to achieve our warfighting mission, then I'm going to do everything in my power to do so.
Thank you. I think we started a few minutes late, so I'm going to take the liberty to end a few minutes late and see if the audience has any questions for our panelists.
We love to hear your questions. And if you could state your name and affiliation to help us get to know each other.
Hi, everyone. My name is Corey Flesser. I work in OSD policy on women, peace, and security, and this was a lovely and intellectually stimulating panel. I'm going to ask you the question that I always get when I want to advance more women, peace, and security in the department and do it meaningfully. Somebody always asks me, what does right look like? So in the tools available to the Department of Defense for some of the cultural shifts that you talk about, the training, the policy initiatives, you know, in your ideal scenario, we've sort of accommodated this masculinities approach. What does right look like? What does this look like in a transformed Department of Defense? Thanks.
So Corey, you actually know my answer because we work together. But I'll share this with everyone. So on women, peace, and security, I'm not necessarily sure there has been a Ministry of Defense or Defense Department that has gotten the institutionalization right from the get yet. And something that's very interesting about the US is there's a lot going on at the operational level. We've got some strategies going on, strategic level, but we don't necessarily have it fully institutionalized yet. And then at the tactical level, if you say women, peace, and security, people are going to look at you cross-eyed because they don't know what it is. What right looks like is if you look at recommendation 3.4 in the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military, there are a number of recommendations that actually give the department a way to operationalize women, peace, and security by professionalizing the workforce professionalizing and standardizing the workforce, and also enabling us to take an operational perspective. And the IRC report is actually very clear that gender advisors are intended to have an operational planning role. And for many with women, peace, and security, because they're unfamiliar with it, when they hear women, like they're like, okay, this is a DE&I initiative, and so this is a personnel issue. Are personnel relevant? Yes. But women, peace, and security, when operationalized in a defense context, is a planning, that is one of your operational planners. And so standardizing the workforce, getting the bureaucracy right so it can be enduring, and for goodness sake, putting resources behind it is how we're going to be successful. And fortunately, Congress did give the Department of Defense adequate resources to be able to implement women, peace, and security for going forward.
I think right looks like a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, guardian, coastie from time to time, gets up, puts their uniform of the day on, and heads into first formation, feeling like they trust the people to their left and right, above and below them, and that they can serve our nation honorably, complete their mission without having any worry or concern that they may be harmed, or without a mentality that's perverted that says it's okay for me to harm the people around me. I think that's what right looks like.
I think to, give an example of what it doesn't look like to start with is in the Independent Review Commission report, there was, maybe it was a footnote or an example given of how the sexual assault trainings and violence prevention trainings that were implemented actually in some cases led to some men feeling like they received this training and kind of thought it was a joke, or like didn't really respond well to it, and then it led them to like conduct more violent behavior after that. And so responding really negatively to the way that the training was given for some men. So I think that has to do with the idea of the plural of masculinities, in that like not all men are going to respond to the same types of trainings or the same types of initiatives the same way, due to their different upbringings, their different experiences with in life in general. And so the DoD and the military is just such a huge force that I think more efforts to sort of that narrow the scope of how certain trainings are given, and even recognizing the different forces as having separate organizational cultures themselves, and then like adapting the training modalities and whatnot to fit the needs of the different types of people that are within the force themselves. And of course, this takes time and a lot of money and a lot of effort, and it's not something so easily done. But I think continuing to just narrow our scope, be nuanced in the way that we're delivering trainings and whatnot on these issues will only serve our collective benefit.
Yeah, and I'm going to step in here. And I think in addition to all of that, thinking about how WPS can be integrated and institutionalized across strategies, policies, and plans. And so not having to pull up the national security strategy, Control F, women, nothing, Control F, gender, nothing, national defense strategy, civilian harm and mitigation response plan, potentially the upcoming IRC response on suicide prevention. I think just normalizing the WPS and gender analysis and a masculinities approach within that is a consistent component of these plans and policies that the Biden White House and hopefully future White Houses pretend to care about. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Catherine Wright from Newcastle University in the UK. So I can see we've got kind of some men in the room, which is really positive, kind of engaging with this issue of kind of masculinities. So my question is, how do we get kind of more men in the room, and how do we get men kind of leading and pushing this agenda forward? Thank you.
I can start. So something I will say, well, 2 points. I think first, just framing this conversation as not through a zero-sum approach, in that like talking about masculinities and bringing men into the fold is going to somehow take away from advancing women or promoting, the causes of the feminist movement or whatnot. Sometimes there's that confusion that like paying attention, bringing men in and speaking to them and talking about masculinities will somehow take away from the really strong efforts on women's advancement and whatnot. So kind of like debunking that myth in some ways. The second thing I'll say is that I think the word of the year or the past few years has sort of become this idea of toxic masculinity. It's really been embraced by the cultural zeitgeist, I think. And so recognizing that that's sort of one strain or type of masculinity, and then moving beyond that and lifting up the more positive notions of masculinities that we see, and the things that we were talking about earlier about like caring for your teammates and caring for those around you, and highlighting that, I think makes certain men feel seen and want to be part of those conversations. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an apologist approach. We can certainly call men out, and some men who have abused power and in a lot of ways, but also really thinking deeply about how we're calling them in as compassionate, collaborative, and supportive human beings into these conversations, and just giving them that space to be a part of that conversation, I think can be a great starting point.
For Christmas, my daughter gave me, she's 27, Tiffany gave me this book, The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love. Bell Hooks, feminist author. And in here, she cites a Maasai warrior. Maasai warriors live in southeastern portion of the continent of Africa. All the attributes of warriors being able to travel long distances in the most austere of conditions, ready to defend their land and hunt dinner. And a Maasai warrior describes the traits of a good warrior, and he says to an interviewer, "I refuse to tell you what makes a good warrior, but I will tell you what makes a great warrior. When the moment calls for fierceness, a great Marani is is very ferocious. And when the moment calls for kindness, he is utterly tender. Now, what makes a great Marani is knowing which trait is needed in each moment. Continues on with Bell Hooks saying, we see that females who are raised with the traits of any person of integrity we see that females who are raised with the traits of any person of integrity can act with tenderness, with assertiveness, and with aggression, and if and when aggression is needed. So to get more men involved in these conversations, it's going to take both men and women to raise this awareness as an issue, because men oftentimes are not sitting around in our fraternity meetings, in our smoke-filled chambers, disparaging women, sometimes because of the proportion difference, sometimes 20 to 1, 30 to 1 ratios of men to women. Men don't really recognize the other in the midst. So some of those unique considerations, or the bad behaviors, or the what we think are good behaviors, are not recognized as being behaviors that are unwelcomed for the often women minorities in our formations.
You know, Miles, you reminded me of, there's a conference that takes place every year, and it's sponsored by a nonprofit, but it's very, very supported by the DoD, and it's called the Joint Women's Leadership Symposium. And it's a conference that pulls in women from all of the armed forces. We have some allies and partners who come every year, and you'll walk into a room and there are 1,000 women in uniform. And I've been going since 2016, and I think in 2016, I was in the ballroom, and of 1,000 women in the room, there were maybe, I had to look for the men, and most of them were speakers. Last year, the proportion looked much more like the inverse of what the military is right now, where it was about 80% women and 20% men. And I didn't have the means to ask all of the men, okay, so why are there now 20% of you here? But it was very clear that the men were there because they wanted to be better leaders. And it was simply that. They wanted to be better leaders of everyone they were leading. And that is a characteristic that we value in the military, that I think we should hope to value in anywhere where we are living and participating in society. And I think it raises an important point that you just highlighted, which is there was an opportunity that was presented for male leaders to learn what they realized that they couldn't possibly know unless they were in a different environment. And so identifying those opportunities and highlighting those opportunities and tacking them onto values that we already know that we share is an opportunity to bring more people into the room.
I feel like we very rarely end on a positive note when we talk about gender in the military or masculinities in the military. And so on that note, I actually will end this. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and to everybody in the audience, thank you so much for taking time out of your 80-degree February day to come and listen to us speak. We really appreciate it, and I hope everyone learned something. And there are refreshments and snacks in the back. So.